few times on our show this year, we've talked about conifers. And conifers are mostly plants that are evergreen. And by evergreen, this means that they hang on to their leaves or their needles throughout the growing season. So they are evergreen, green throughout all growing seasons. Well, there are a few plants that are evergreen, but yet they are not conifers. They are what we call broadleaf evergreens. And some examples are hollies, boxwoods, laurels, and this plant, the southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora. And the flowers of the southern magnolia certainly are grand. They're really huge, they're deliciously fragrant, and they are on the trees in the months of May, June, and July. The tree itself is a grand tree of the southern landscape. The southern magnolia is native to the southeastern part of the United States, and the flowers are actually known as the state flower of both Mississippi and Louisiana. So this shows you how highly this plant is esteemed. Now, down in its southern, southeastern United States habitat, these trees can get up to 100 feet tall, but they're not going to get quite that tall here in Oklahoma. Over in Tulsa and some of the other areas in the eastern part of Oklahoma, they'll get their tallest, but as we move out into the central part of Oklahoma and the western part of the state, they're not going to get quite that tall. These trees here are a little over 30 feet tall, and they've been planted here at our studio gardens for a number of years. Well, another thing that we have to think about when growing southern magnolias in the central and western part of Oklahoma is the alkalinity of our soil. In their native habitat in the southeastern part of the United States, they grow in soils that are high in organic matter, get adequate moisture, and they're a little bit acidic. And of course, the further west you go in Oklahoma, the soils get a little more alkaline, and magnolias are sensitive to magnesium deficiency. So one way to get around that problem is to add some magnesium sulfate or Epsom salt whenever you plant the plant in the landscape. Now, a good heavy dose at planting time should be all that is needed. I've known some gardeners who have created a toxic soil by adding Epsom salts once a year around their magnolia tree, thinking it would get it to bloom a little bit more, but you don't need to do that. You can actually build up too high levels of magnesium in that way. So again, just a heavy dose at planting time that is in the central and western part of the state, and then see how the plant reacts in the years to follow. But magnesium sulfate will help them green up and will provide just a beautiful dark green color like we have on this tree. And that's one of the things I like about the southern magnolia. You get just this curtain of green foliage, and you have that curtain of green foliage if you leave the lower limbs on the southern magnolia tree. I highly recommend that you leave those limbs, let them grow all the way to the ground, because if they are cut, if the tree is limbed up, it kind of takes a little bit away from the tree, and also it's so hard to get anything to grow underneath the southern magnolia because they do have such a dense shade. Now, leaving those limbs all the way to the ground will also hide all of those leaves that otherwise you're going to be raking up. And those leaves are dropped naturally in the early to mid part of summer. The southern magnolia is hardy to zone 7, but we can grow them in zone 6 here in Oklahoma. Just be aware that it is possible for them to lose their leaves on a really cold winter. About 10 years ago here in our studio garden, we got down to 22 degrees below zero, and this group of southern magnolias had about 70% of their leaves turn brown. But the tree recovered, and you can see here 10 years later, it's fully leafed out and doing quite well. Another thing to remember is if you do leave those limbs all the way to the ground like this, you're going to need a lot of room in the landscape. Now, if you have a small landscape, you could plant the cultivar Little Gem of the southern magnolia, because it only gets about 20 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. Otherwise, make sure you have lots of room. You want to plant the beautiful southern magnolia.